Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us today for our June session of the Lunch and Learn series brought to you by the External Committee of the Graduate College. My name is Jungmin Park and I'll be the moderator for this afternoon's session. We're very excited for two of our scholars to have the opportunity to share their presentations with you today. So we'll start off with some opening remarks and then I'll introduce our presenters. They'll each have about 20 minutes to share their presentation with us, and at the end, there'll be a Q&A period. And you can use a Q&A box that's at the bottom of the screen to answer your questions at any time during their presentations. You don't have to wait until the very end to ask, and I'll be the one reading out the questions at the end, and then we can answer those questions at the Q&A session at the very end. And finally, we'll conclude our session with a short summary. So that's just a brief overview of how the session will go. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in Southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tustina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and the Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. I'd also like to know that although we're connecting virtually today, the University of Calgary is situated on land that's adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and that the traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mokkinstisi, which we now call the city of Calgary. I'd also like to take a couple of seconds to acknowledge that acknowledge today's announcement that 751 unmarked graves have been discovered at a residential school in Saskatchewan. And also like to give you an information that the Indian Residential Schools crisis line, as seen below here, is available 24 hours a day for anyone experiencing pain or distress as a result of their residential school experience. So I want to briefly introduce what the Lunch and Learn session is all about. It's a public presentation series that aims to bridge the graduate college with the Calgary community. And our series has been ongoing since April of 2020. And during each Lunch and Learn presentation, graduate scholars are able to present their diverse research projects for the public. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two speakers of the day. So first, we have Gong, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Mechanical and Manufacturing Engineering. Her research is focused on underlying mechanisms of friction phenomena, and her presentation today will be on investigating friction behavior of materials on a small scale. Our second speaker will be Emma McLaughlin, who's a Master's of Science student and soon to be PhD student in the Health and Wellness Lab at the University of Calgary. Her research is focused on developing resources to support movement among children and adolescents affected by cancer. And her presentation today will be on co-creating the International Pediatric Oncology Exercise Guidelines, shortened to iPOEG Toolkit. So now I'll hand it off to Penny to share her slides and start her presentation.
Can everybody see my screen now? Hello?
Sorry, I can't see your screen. Maybe I'll stop sharing and then you can try again.
Thank you.
Yep, I can see it now. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, first of all, thanks for the introduction, and thank you everybody for taking your time to join this virtual event. I'm Penny. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in the second-year graduate school scholar, and today I'm going to talk about investigating friction behavior of materials on small scale. So I've actually started my research in this field since the beginning of my master's. So it's been a few years. I have been worked in different projects, and here I divide them into two parts. One is the friction of graphene at the nanoscale. I'll talk about the unique behaviors, how it could be affected by environmental factors. And this part is mainly done through experiments by using this ultra high vacuum atomic microscopy, which can allow us to kind of visualize the what's going on in the small world. And the second part is I'll talk about adhesion, because it's like in the nano world, adhesion is always associated with graphene, with friction. I'll talk about the unique behavior and how it will vary with the thickness. And this part is done using finite element simulation. And now let's get started with the friction part. So friction is a concept that we are all familiar with. It's everywhere in our everyday life. In high school, probably junior high, we learned that friction is the force between two surfaces that are sliding or trying to slide. We learned this classical formula F equals mu times N. F is the friction force, mu is the coefficient of friction, and N is the normal force. Based on this formula, we came up with this conclusion that friction has nothing to do with the contact area, and the two objects with equal mass would have equal friction force, right? Well, this actually works quite well at a macro scale. However, today I'm just here to tell you that's probably not the case at the small scale. Before that, I'd like to introduce a term called nanotribology. It's a young field that looks at the origins of friction, adhesion, lubrication, and wear at the nanoscale. You probably ask, why will we look at this at the nanoscale? Well, if you look at this this picture at the macro scale, we can see the interface between the two surfaces is actually pretty flat. But if we zoom in to the micro scale, we can see this contact actually consists of a large number of asperities. And if we further zoom in to the nanoscale, we can see what is actually involved is one asperity and a surface. So as a result, normally we think friction is proportional to load and independent to the contact area. However, at the nanoscale, it seems that friction is directly related to contact area A here and the interfacial shear stress tau. But this is just a very, very highly simplified phenomena. There are still many, many unanswered questions regarding underlying mechanism of friction. But what is for sure here is that at this small scale, contact area does make a huge difference. So my research is focused on looking at the friction behavior of graphene at the nanoscale. Just a little bit of background. The material I'm looking at is graphene, which is an atomically thin 2D material. It has many interesting friction properties. For example, here is a result I got 3 years ago. We can see from the color contrast, 1-layer graphene and 3-layer graphene can reduce friction substantially comparing to the substrate by looking at the color contrast. And also it is also layer dependent. As you can see here on the right, the friction on 3-layer graphene in green is lower than 1-layer graphene in black. Additionally, under the same normal force, those hollow squares for the unloading process are higher than those solid squares for the loading process, right? And this is known as friction hysteresis. And furthermore, when I transfer the sample from the humid condition to dry nitrogen, what happens is that the friction became even smaller and the loading and unloading curves overlapped with each other. And this suggested that friction behavior is strongly affected by environment. And the second friction behavior of graphene that I like to introduce is atomic stick slip. This can be done it can be seen when we scan samples at the nanoscale under some particular settings. As I mentioned earlier, we can use, I use an equipment called AFM atomic force microscopy, and it has a very small tip. And what happens is that when the tip was dragged on the surface, the tip and the sample are initially sticking together, like we can see here. And then the tip will slip down from the surface potential maxima to minima. And this process will repeat again and again, and it can be visualized as the sawtooth pattern of the lateral force. When the tip was sliding backwards, the same pattern of lateral force will be obtained like this. And eventually, a friction loop consisting of forward and backward lateral forces can be formed. And this enclosed area corresponding to the magnitude of the friction force. And the slope of the line profile K can tell something about the stiffness of the sample. And the difference between the maximum and minimum gives us, this E value gives us some information about surface energy. So this image actually can give us a lot of information. But however, those parameters are very environmentally sensitive. So in order to get more accurate values for them, we have to make sure there is no environmental influence. In order to get rid of the environmental influence, later on, I only conduct my experiments in the ultra-high vacuum condition by using this UHV AFM, ultra-high vacuum atomic force microscopy. But what I further found is that this UHV condition is not enough yet. Other than that, we also want to make sure the sample is clean enough, because I found that the surface contamination could also affect the friction behavior of graphene a lot. And heating the sample at a high temperature is a way that we always use to get rid of the surface contamination. But to see how exactly the surface contamination could influence friction, I prepared two groups of samples. One group of the heated graphene sample and another group of heated sample, which were heated at 800 Celsius degree in a ultra high vacuum chamber. And then once I have those two groups of samples, I performed the friction measurements on the sample at the nanoscale. And here are the results. You can see this slide shows the comparison of the atomically scaled stick slip behavior. The first column is the unheated graphene, and the second column is the heated graphene. We can see the first row is the lateral force image of graphene at the nanoscale. And the second row is the friction loops, which were extracted from the friction images above. Like I said, the area enclosed in the loop corresponds to friction magnitude. So we can see that the loop's area is way smaller for the heated graphene on the right, and also for the unheated graphene, we can see those stick slip line profiles show this ascending trend, which was referred as friction strengthening in the literature. But this friction strengthening phenomena was not seen anymore on the heated graphene on the right. Right? So there is a huge difference between the unheated graphene and heated graphene. But this slide shows the difference at one given applied load. If we further increase the applied load and then decrease it, we can see I can get a bunch of images like this, and we can see the whole load-dependent stick slip measurement. And here is the results. We can see that if we still compare the unheated graphene with the heated graphene, you can see that the friction hysteresis was observed on the left was not seen anymore on the right. And what is interesting is that we can see this negative friction coefficient here. What does it mean is when we decrease the load, the friction force actually increases. That's very interesting, but this is not seen anymore on the heated graphene. And also on the heated graphene, we can see the friction force is between 0 to 1 nanonewtons. That can be actually considered as super lubricant. And the most important thing is that all these observations on the heated graphene here are consistent with previous theoretical predictions. So if that means if we conduct experiments at UHV condition and make sure the sample surface is clean enough by heating it at a high temperature, experimental observations could match perfectly with the theoretical predictions. That's about the experimental work of graphene regarding its friction behavior. And then let's move to the simulation work on the adhesion part. So for adhesion, usually it is so small that it can be just ignored at the macro scale, but it could become relatively large and significant as the size decreases to the small scale. And also on the small scale, friction and adhesion are always linked together because you can see from this formula, they are all related to this letter A. A means contact area. So it tells us if there is any change in contact area, the friction and adhesion should also change. Like, but as I said, as I mentioned earlier, friction of graphene will increase as the number of graphene layers changes. However, we can see from this experimental results, this is not the case for adhesion. We didn't see any variation. This polar force is actually the maximum adhesion force. Since this trend was not seen in experiments, so the objective of this project is to see whether adhesion is layer dependent by doing simulation instead. But the challenging part is for graphing, because we are looking at the nanoscale, so things are not actually continuum. At the nanoscale, we can see from this picture, those layers are not actually in contact, but FEM simulation can only simulate those parts that are in contact. So like we have to self-define the interactions between the layers and what's going on between the layers. And there is some analytical and math work going on behind. But in general, to achieve that objective, I simulated the adhesion measurement process in what's going on in EFM. And in this simulation, two extreme configurations were considered. This is an example of two-layer model for demonstration here. In configuration 1, graphene layers are discrete and there is no friction between those layers, so they can freely slide laterally with each other. In configuration 2, those graphene layers are treated as a continuum elastic bulk, meaning that they are totally constrained together, so the frictions between layers are infinite. So having those two extreme configurations, all the cases experienced by graphene layers can be captured, I believe. And here are the simulation results showing this simulation process. Both of them are 4-layer model. This figure 2 actually has a larger thickness, but we cannot see it from this model here. So let me play this again. So firstly, the tip approaches a graphene layer, and then when the tip was withdrawn, the adhesion force increases first and then decreases until the tip and sample were detached. And this maximum adhesion acting on the tip in the withdrawing process is the pull-out force. Pull-out force is, and this is what we want to look at because that is the maximum adhesion force. And here is the simulation results. We can see the maximum normal force on the curves are the pull-out force, as I said, which is actually the bottom part of here of this curve. If you look at this zoom in image from the green curve to the black curve, which is from 1-layer model to 4-layer model, we can see a small but monotonic increase in the adhesion force. And the exact value are given in the tables below here. So for both pull-out force and the work of adhesion from layer 1 to layer 4, there is a monotonic increase for both of the configurations, right? So therefore, we can conclude that even though the variation is small, the adhesion does increase with increase of thickness. And by doing this simulation results, we are able to investigate something that cannot be seen through experiments, which is a very good supplementary. So in summary, first of all, I look at the, so I would like to say that friction on small scale is different from friction at the macro scale. And this also applies to adhesion. And then I have talked about the unique behavior of graphene. And those behaviors are very interesting, but it also can be influenced by the environmental factors. And then the adhesion of graphene can increase with the number of graphene layers. Even though it's small, there is still an increasing trend. And that's about my research, about my talk. Finally, I would like to thank all the support from my supervisor, Dr. Philip Evers, and also all the group members and all the funding agencies. And that's all for my presentation.
Thank you so much, Penny. And we'll jump right into the next talk by Emma.
Just one moment here. I don't think that you can see this, so just give me one moment. Zoom is now not wanting to put my power. Okay, I believe you all should be able to see this here now, hopefully. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Valeria. Alrighty, hello everyone, and thank you for taking the time to be here this afternoon. Thank you to Young Min for moderating this session, Valeria and the external committee for hosting these lunch and learn sessions. My name is Emma McLaughlin. I'm a master's student in the Health and Wellness Lab at the University of Calgary. And today I'm excited to talk to you about my master's work, which has been working to co-create the International Pediatric Oncology Exercise Guidelines, or iPOEG, toolkit with end users. So once you leave yet another Zoom session today, I'm hoping you'll leave with a few key learnings. I'll first provide you with a brief overview of physical activity for children and adolescents affected by cancer. I'll provide you with some information about the International Pediatric Oncology Exercise Guidelines. And from there, I will talk about my master's work, which was to develop the International Pediatric Oncology Guidelines Toolkit, and then talk about next steps for this work. So to get started, physical activity or pediatric cancer refers to cancer that is diagnosed in a child or adolescent, typically before the age of 19 years. So this group is a small and distinct population because a diagnosis of cancer in this age is quite rare, and cancers differ from their older counterparts. So cancer diagnosis will vary from adults. As well, children and adolescents are part of complex family systems, and they're only just beginning to learn how to engage with the world around them. And in many cases can experience negative effects spanning physical effects. So things such as increased pain, decreased strength, decreased flexibility, psychosocial effects or psychological effects such as reduced quality of life and self-esteem, social effects, including isolation due to their treatment, as well as cognitive effects. So this can include things such as difficulties with impulse control. And because of this, researchers have concerned themselves with identifying interventions or strategies to help counteract or minimize this burden while helping to promote well-being for children and adolescents affected by cancer. And so one strategy that has been found across strategies to improve well-being is physical activity. And this has been found to decrease the negative effects experienced within this population. However, most children and adolescents are not active enough to accrue these benefits. One barrier impacting physical activity participation in this population may be the lack of efforts to translate or move available evidence into the hands of those who will use and/or benefit from it. So these individuals are known as end users. And moving evidence into the hands of end users and ultimately into practice requires concerted knowledge translation efforts. And typical knowledge translation initiatives in academia often stop at peer-reviewed publications or presentations, which may not reach all intended end users. So you can think of children and adolescents might not be attending this presentation today, or families, or they may not have time to read a 20-page manuscript. And so the information supporting physical activity for children and adolescents affected by cancer may not actually be getting into their hands. And so as you can see, this can be a problem. So to help fill this gap, I was part of an international team of 131 experts from over 23 countries, led by Drs. Koulos Reed and Wers in the Health and Wellness Lab, to co-create the first international pediatric oncology exercise guidelines, which I'll be referring to as the iPOEG. And the iPOEG provides guideline and recommendation statements supporting and promoting physical activity for children and adolescents affected by cancer. So next steps from this work was the need to move the iPOEG to practice through the co-creation of clear, concise, and user-friendly resources with end users. So things that they could actually be able to use to learn about these guidelines and put them into practice. And so co-creation is the process of meaningful involvement with end users throughout the entire research process. And this is essential when using an integrated knowledge translation approach. An integrated knowledge translation approach is where researchers work with end users who have identified a problem in order to create practical solutions to help move evidence into practice. So frameworks have been developed to help guide researchers through the process of translating knowledge, so moving it to practice, and can provide researchers with useful and relevant information for engaging end users through co-creation. And one relevant framework that I'll be talking about is the knowledge to action framework, which ensures that available evidence makes it into the hands of end users. So the knowledge to action framework is comprised of two components, which I will walk you through. First is knowledge creation, which is comprised of 3 sequential phases, which are used in order to create knowledge products. So these are things such as guidelines, videos, informational resources. The second component is the action cycle, which is comprised of 7 iterative phases used to apply and implement the knowledge products from this knowledge creation cycle. So the development of the iPOEG, so those guideline and recommendation statements, occurred within this knowledge creation cycle, which resulted in the knowledge products, which were the guideline and recommendation statements themselves. And next steps from that work identified the need to move the guidelines from this knowledge creation cycle into the action cycle to get it into the hands of end users. So the overall purpose of my thesis was to work with end users to identify the types of resources needed, so the resources that they would need to help move the iPOEG into practice or use these guideline and recommendation statements, to work with end users to co-create resources and content, and to work with end users to co-create dissemination plans to distribute the finalized iPOEG toolkit. So learning how we could get the iPOEG toolkit and resources into the hands of other end users. And so we did this by following the knowledge to action framework, which I outlined and I'll talk about here again briefly, and followed by using the integrated knowledge translation approach to guide the co-creation process. So this study occurred within the first 3 phases of the action cycle. So we're now talking about these 3 outer phases here. So first, a problem was identified, which was the need to move the iPOEG guideline and recommendation statements into practice. That was identified from creating the iPOEG initially. Next, we adapted knowledge to the local context by working with end users to co-create resources and content based on their need. So again, what was the resources that they need and what was the information that they needed to help move it into practice? We then assessed the barriers to knowledge use, the barriers and facilitators, by asking end users, again, what the resources that they would need, the resources and content, how to make the resources easier to use, and how to get the resources into the hands of others. So this was done by working with end users who we categorized into two groups. We first had professionals, which was comprised of healthcare providers, qualified exercise professionals, and community-based organizations. These are all professional groups who work very closely with children and adolescents affected by cancer. And then the other categorization was patients and families. So this was comprised of children and adolescents affected by cancer, as well as caregivers. And so throughout the remainder of the presentation, when I mention the study team, that refers to myself, my supervisor, Dr. Kulos Reed, and mentor, Dr. Wers, who were involved in this project. So we first identified end users using convenient sampling and snowball sampling based on the study team's awareness of end users in these specific groups who would potentially be interested in participating in this study. So end users expressed interest, they provided informed consent, and they completed a socio-demographic survey. Simultaneously, we conducted systematic searches to identify existing physical activity resources. And this was to provide us with a starting point to understand what resources already exist, which may help to inform what we will develop. We then recruited a design specialist from Mount Royal University to help in designing and creating the iPOEG toolkit with the end users. And finally, guided by a concurrent mixed method study design where we were using both quantitative and qualitative data, this was collected and analyzed throughout to ensure that the end user feedback was being incorporated. So the qualitative data, the quantitative data, which we received from the socio-demographic survey and closed-ended worksheet responses, was analyzed using descriptive statistics, and the qualitative data from the open-ended worksheet responses, focus groups, and interviews was analyzed using content analysis. So we first began working with professionals, which included 9 healthcare providers, 22 qualified exercise professionals, and 5 community-based organizations. Data collection with professionals occurred over 2 phases. In phase 1, professionals completed worksheet 1, which asked them to rank and order potential resources based on the importance for that individual end user. A focus group was then conducted with each end user group to further determine the resources and content that each end user group would need, and to gain insights into what should be included within the iPOEG brand. So the iPOEG brand would include things such as the logo, slogan, typography, and font, as well as the colors. And so end users who were unable to attend the focus group had the opportunity to complete a supplementary worksheet, and individuals who had additional feedback outside of the focus group could also complete this additional worksheet. From here, the information was integrated by the study team and the design specialist. So this was done by me consolidating the feedback for both the iPOEG brand and iPOEG toolkit, which was reviewed by Drs. Kulos, Reed, and Wers. From here, I then reviewed this document with the design specialist who began working on both components. 5 iterations of the iPOEG brand and 5 iterations of the iPOEG toolkit occurred between the study team and design specialist. And simultaneously, I began developing a social media kit with sample posts and content based on end user feedback from the focus groups. So this slide here shows you initial draft of the iPOEG logo on the left and the 3rd iteration of the iPOEG logo on the right. So as you can see, both versions include green colors. However, there was nothing within the logo in this first iteration to represent movement. And this was specific feedback from the end users in the focus groups. So this was an attempt that was made for the version on the right, as well as the full title iPOEG included, as individuals might not know what iPOEG stands for. So this version or slide here shows you that 3rd iteration shown on the left and the 5th iteration on the right. So they may look similar, again, based on the green colors, same font. The title was now presented below here. And the difference was that movement was now integrated within the O of iPOEG as opposed to the I. And this was to hopefully ensure that when individuals were looking at this logo, they could see the representation of movement within the entire logo, and instead of potentially seeing that I as something separate. I'll now share some iterations from the iPOEG toolkit. So this slide here shows the initial draft of one of the adolescent-facing posters on the left, and the third iteration of the adolescent-facing poster on the right. So they may look similar as they both include a collage of black and white photos and green colors. There were some important differences and changes that were made based on end user feedback. So first, we removed this additional iPOEG guideline and recommendation statement, as that would be included on another poster. So to decrease the amount of content that was on this poster. And some images were changed to include less yoga and less intense activities. So including or removing this basketball image where adolescents were shown to be engaging in more intense physical activity. So now this third iteration is shown on the left and the fifth iteration is shown on the right. Again, they look quite similar here. The difference is really coming back to changes in the images, which were based on the end user feedback to be more playful and fun to represent adolescents. This slide here shows you the difference between one of the adolescent-facing posters on the left and a child-facing poster on the right. The main difference here is that for the child's version, we used icons to represent movement. And this was based on feedback to represent more cartoon-like images and to be more playful and fun for children. So moving on to phase 2, worksheet 2 asked professionals to review and provide feedback on the posters and infographics that were designed by the design specialist, some of which I just showed you there. And they were also asked to review the social media kit that I developed. In addition, end users were asked to identify dissemination plans in order to help move the iPOEG into the hands of other end users. Again, information was consolidated by the study team and design specialist, which I'll review in the coming slides. So meanwhile, while phase 2 was occurring with professionals, 1 adolescent and 2 caregivers expressed interest, consented, and participated in 1 phase of data collection. This phase of data collection involved interviews where patients and families were asked to identify potential resources and content, the reason for their importance, as well as identify potential dissemination strategies. In addition, these end users reviewed the iPOEG toolkit and brand and provided feedback on both. So once again, I consolidated the feedback from the professionals and patients and families on the iPOEG brand and iPOEG toolkit, which was reviewed by Drs. Kulos, Reed, and Wers. Priority items were determined and reviewed by the design specialist, who began working on updating the iPOEG toolkit as no requests or revisions were made for the iPOEG brand. Simultaneously, I began updating the iPOEG social media kit based on end user feedback, and also began developing a video kit which will help inform future resource development, which will include educational videos for end users. And in terms of the dissemination plans, in total, the end users collectively identified 6 dissemination strategies, which I'll review in the coming slides. So the finalized iPOEG brand includes a logo, slogan, typography, and colors. So the finalized iPOEG logo includes the acronym iPOEG with the full title spelled out below, again, to educate individuals who might not be aware of this acronym, and also includes the representation of movement integrated within the logo representing the O. The slogan "Move More" is a key phrase from the iPOEG guideline and recommendation statements and is included within all 3 resulting manuscripts from that work. The typography or font was selected to be both professional yet fun and is accessible through Adobe, which is an important consideration which may be required for future modifications to the iPOEG toolkit. And finally, blue and green colors were selected based on end user feedback that these colors are fun, calm, encouraging, and attractive. So the finalized iPOEG toolkit, what does it include? Well, we have a variety of different posters and infographics. We have 4 child-facing posters, 3 adolescent-facing posters, 6 child-facing infographics, and 3 adolescent-facing infographics. Some of these examples are shown here. And you may be able to see that some include more color than others, which was a specific consideration for the end users based on costs associated with printing. In addition, the design specialist developed 3 poster templates that end users may wish to use and modify within their own setting. So they may have specific content that they want to promote, so they can use these poster templates to modify based on their needs. And finally, in terms of the dissemination strategies identified by the end users, these include engaging champions. So end users who support physical activity for children and adolescents affected by cancer and who may be willing to promote the iPOEG guidelines as well as the iPOEG toolkit with their colleagues. End users also suggested that the study team should offer education sessions and facilitate group discussions, both between and among end user groups. And that brief emails and brief email updates may be an important way to share this information. And that social media posts may be another way to engage other end users who may not be able to be reached through emails. Specifically, the healthcare providers suggested that the study team continue with academic presentations, and that moving forward, mainstream news outlets such as ads on the television or within the newspaper may be an important way to share this information. So in terms of this study and what it contributes to the fields of physical activity for children and adolescents affected by cancer, in terms of methodological contributions, this study is among the first to report using an integrated knowledge translation approach in order to co-create resources with 5 end user groups within this field. In terms of theoretical contributions, this study built upon the iPOEG and development of the iPOEG to include additional phases of the knowledge to action framework, including the action cycle. As I mentioned, the 3 phases that this study included. And in terms of practical contributions, the iPOEG toolkit and dissemination plans co-created by the end users have the potential and capacity to ensure that the iPOEG is moved into practice. And finally, in terms of next steps, I will be continuing on and starting my PhD with Dr. Koulos-Reed in September. And we will be working to apply the remaining phases of the knowledge to action framework, as well as engaging additional end users to help move the iPOEG toolkit into practice, as well as modify any resources based on end user feedback moving forward. There are numerous people who I would like to thank for their support and guidance throughout the past 2 years, specifically to my supervisor, Dr. Nicole Koulos-Reed, my committee who supported me throughout this project, my funding sources, the Health and Wellness Lab, Jasmine Kelsey, who was the design specialist for this work, as well as the end users who participated in this study. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Emma, for your talk. Thank you both to Penny and Emma for their time as well as their insight. I'd also like to now move on to the Q&A session, and I'll read out the questions that were sent to the Q&A during the 2 presentations. But if you have any other questions, please type them into the Q&A box and I'll read them out. So the first question is for Penny. What are some examples of practical or real world applications of your research in products that are made from graphene? Oh, I think you're muted, sorry.
Sorry about that. I just got so excited about being asking this question because we get this question a lot. Because our research is very fundamental. So yeah, right. Our research is fundamental, but graphene has a lot of real world application. For example, graphene can be used as a dry lubricant or some like anti-wear coating materials. So if we are able to have a better understanding of what's going on, of the fundamental mechanism of friction, we'll be able to better control it and have a better application of that. I think that's the meaning of my research. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Penny. And the next question is for Emma. So the question is, you talked about your next steps being to pursue a PhD, but what other resources do you think will be developed for the iPOEG toolkit?
Thanks for that, Youngmin. So since this was a co-creation project, moving forward, it's important that we continue to get that end user feedback to inform what additional resources may need to be made. Some suggestions from the end users based on this study, but were not created based on timelines and pragmatics. There was the suggestion of educational videos. So we did collect information on what these topics should be. So quick tip videos on how to become more physically active, how to have conversations, so a healthcare provider, how to have conversations with their patients. And users would love to see an app being developed. So that could be something moving forward and house all of these additional resources. And yeah, so those are some of the main ideas, but moving forward, it'd be important to get feedback from the end users. And we also acknowledge that this is a first step of the iPOEG toolkit, and it's not the final version. So it will serve and live as a living document, meaning that modifications can be made based on end user feedback.
Thank you. And this other question is also for now Penny. So you had mentioned that the friction images were acquired by something called an ultra-high vacuum atomic force microscopy. Can you briefly explain how that works exactly?
Yeah, for sure. So it has two parts. One part is AFM, atomic force microscopy. The second part is ultra high vacuum condition. And I'll maybe talk about the AFM first. Actually, I have a slide up. I have a backup slide. If I can share my screen now. Let me. So here, this one. This shows how the friction, the AFM works. So what happens is we have this this laser beam, and it hits to the back of the AFM tip, and this laser was got reflected from the back and detected by this detector, and we can know if there is any change happens on the sample surface. This detector will see a difference, and that signal will be converted to the force. That's how it works. And this is the AFM part. Because they are very sensitive, so it allows us to see the changes on the sample surface. For the ultra high vacuum AFM, so it has many pumps. We have three stages pumps. So it just helps us to evacuate the air one by one, and then eventually we can get a very low vacuum atmosphere pressure, and yeah, that allows us to exclude almost all the environmental factors in air. Yeah. I'll stop
Thank you for that. Yep. Okay, I'll go back to this. So we have one last question, and it's for Emma now. So what was the most surprising feedback that you received from end users? If you can share one thing that you can think of.
I think the most surprising feedback we got was from the professional end user groups. Based on previous literature, we had anticipated or thought that the professionals would request specific resources for themselves. And what we learned from the focus groups was that the healthcare providers, qualified exercise professionals, and community-based organizations were only interested at this point in time to have resources that were driven and developed for children and adolescents affected by cancer. So I think that was the most surprising feedback that we had at this point in time.
So those are all the questions that we had for today. Thank you so much to our presenters for sharing their research with us, and to our guests who took the time out of their week to join us and participate in the Q&A session. Your questions were greatly appreciated, and it was such a pleasure to have everyone here. Please feel free to connect with us on social media and visit our website as listed below for any information about our upcoming events. We hope to see you again soon, and bye for today.